Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your all being here. On behalf of Citizens Union, I welcome you. My name is Dadey. I'm the Executive Director, and we are pleased to host this event this evening with the New York Law School. You know, Citizens Union has a proud history of fighting corruption and fighting for political reform. When we were founded in 1897, we were founded in response to the corruption of Tammany Hall and the affairs of the City of New York, just before the City of New York became the consolidated City of New York, taking in the cities of Brooklyn and Queens, with the idea that we would stem the tide and influence of Tammany Hall across the river. And we succeeded at first. We started out as a political party, and we helped to elect the first reform mayor of the City of New York, Seth Low, in 1901. He lasted 2 years before Tammany Hall took back City Hall. But throughout our history, we have fought cronyism, patronage, and helped bring about the civil service system, fighting for all kinds of reform to the way in which our city and state governments operate. We helped create the city's campaign finance system, and more recently, improved the state's ethics, oversight, and enforcement mechanism. And as a result of those laws that were passed in 2011, we've seen the kind of activity in Albany that brought a criminal complaint against Speaker Sheldon Silver because he failed to disclose a certain source of outside income that was required on those new disclosure reforms. So Citizens Union has a long history, and we're very pleased that you're here tonight to help us continue in our fight against corruption and for political reform. It's my pleasure to bring up to the podium here the Dean and President of the New York Law School, who will introduce our featured speaker tonight, Attorney General Schneiderman. Dean Crowell was the trusted and longtime counselor to Mayor Bloomberg, and prior to that, he was the Assistant Corporation Counsel. He also currently serves as a member of the Conflicts of Interest Board and served on many city charter revision commissions, either as counsel or director or commissioner. Most recently, as a volunteer, he served as chair of the Brooklyn Public Library, and probably most importantly of all his civic activities, he's on the board of Citizens Union. As the 16th president of the New York Law School, Dean Crowell has focused on making this school New York's law school and was recognized in 2013 by Cranes as one of its people to watch in higher education. Their hosting this event is just one example of how he is leading New York Law School to greater levels of accomplishment and civic engagement. It's my pleasure to introduce President and Dean Anthony Crowell.
Thanks so much, Dick, for that very warm welcome. And I want to welcome everyone here this evening to New York Law School, or as we like to say, New York's Law School. Today's event is very timely, focusing on real and perceived corruption and ethical challenges facing Albany. We have an incredible group of speakers today and the honor of having Attorney General Eric Schneiderman giving the keynote address. First, I want to thank Dick and Citizens Union for their tireless work advocating for integrity, honesty, and efficiency in government. Under Dick's leadership, Citizens Union has been a leading voice for change in Albany, and recent events have only reinforced the need for reform and the relevance and importance of organizations like Citizens Union. The images of elected officials being arrested have become all too common in New York for the last several years. Every time a public official is arrested, there's always a brief and frenzied conversation about game-changing reforms that should be implemented. The change is slow to happen, if at all. There's an incredible amount of important work that needs to be done by our elected officials. And the never-ending scandals and questionable conduct inhibits effective policymaking. This morning, right here at New York Law School, we had an event about a vital topic, raising the age of criminal responsibility in New York. And the keynote speaker, Brian Stevenson, from the Equal Justice Initiative, spoke passionately about the inequities in our justice system. And the one thing he said that I felt stood out and applies here is that in order to achieve change, people need to get outside of their comfort zones. Too often, Albany falls back on complacency and inertia, and our policymakers will truly have to get outside their comfort zone in order to push through meaningful policy and cultural changes. And as you know, our state motto is Excelsior, or Ever Upward. It's on the state seal and on every official document. And it should inspire our leaders to listen to their better angels and fix what ails this state. Let me acknowledge the incredible panel we have assembled here tonight. Richard Briffault, Vice Chair of Citizens Union and a Professor of Legislation at Columbia Law School, and also the Chair of the city's Conflicts of Interest Board. He's a wonderful chair, so thank you for being here, Richard. A former Assembly member, Richard Brodsky, Senior Fellow at Demos and Adjunct Assistant Professor of Public Policy at NYU Wagner, and Jennifer Rodgers, the Executive Director of the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity, and Dick will certainly give more expansive introductions. All of our panelists are leaders in reforming government, and I've worked with many of them, so thank you all for being here. And now it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce Attorney General Eric Schneiderman as tonight's keynote speaker. The Attorney General has been making waves on a number of fronts and has done a great deal of work in policing Albany and local governments. In recent years, his office has arrested and indicted and won convictions of a number of state and local legislators, government officials, and government contractors on charges that have included embezzlement, bribery, and extortion. He's also been leading a number of initiatives that have made a real difference in people's everyday lives, and in many cases, he's saved lives. He's also his program to provide Naloxone to every police department in the state has already made an incredible difference in saving lives, and he's recently achieved a groundbreaking agreement with 3 credit reporting agencies that will make it much easier for millions of people around the country to fix their credit and not fall victim to errors in their credit reports that prevent them from receiving loans, mortgages, or getting a job. All of those achievements, combined with his work to reach settlements that have brought billions of dollars back to New Yorkers, and his work on environmental protection and achieving greater social and economic justice have been remarkable. So it's truly an honor to have him here, and I'm proud to welcome the 65th Attorney General for the state of New York, Eric Schneiderman.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Kroll, for that generous introduction, and thank you for your service to the city and the work you do now to prepare our next generation of great lawyers. And let me acknowledge some others here who embody our aspirations for reform, including the evening's panelists, my friend Richard Briffault of Columbia Law School, my colleague and friend, former Assemblymember Richard Brodsky, now at Demos, and Jennifer Rodgers of the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity. I also do want to mention there are a few others in the audience who have been stalwarts in the cause of reform for a while. Susan Lerner has joined us from Common Cause, Larry Norden from the Brennan Center, and my predecessor in the state Senate, who was called the flamethrower of the Senate, Franz Leichter. It's wonderful to have you here tonight. So, no group is more closely associated with the successful reforms of government over the last 100 years than Citizens Union. There is no better place to speak about the opportunity and challenge of this moment for what I believe is truly an emerging reform movement in New York than at a Citizens Union forum. And I'm grateful to Dick Dadey for his leadership, and I applaud him and all the members of Citizens Union for your proud record of accomplishment. Let us build on that record tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, a young legislator from Manhattan goes to Albany. He is earnest but not naive. He is ethical but wants to get things done. And in his first session, he sponsors a piece of legislation that he believes should become law quickly because there's no opposition on the merits. The bill also happens to be important to some wealthy corporate interests. He moves to bring the legislation to the floor, and the bill faces delay after inexplicable delay. The young legislator is sidelined. His colleagues in the legislature withhold their support for the bill, waiting for the money to flow, and flow it does. Contributions to individual legislators and party organizations made by the corporate interests that stand to benefit. At the end of the session, when bills pass by the dozen overnight, utterly devoid of sunlight, figuratively and literally, this legislation slips into the pile, passed by both houses with no public notice and no meaningful opposition. The system has worked for the legislators and party committees, but the bewildered young legislator feels that for the public and for the public interest, the system has utterly failed. I entered the state Senate in 1999 and served there until 2010 when I was elected Attorney General. I saw a lot of things in Albany that appalled me. I rebelled and had my district redrawn, and every one of my bills killed for years as a result of that rebellion. But the young legislator in the story isn't me. It's Theodore Roosevelt when he took his seat in the State Assembly in 1882. Corruption has been a feature of government in the Empire State for a long time. The reporter and historian Paul Grundle tells of a $1,000 bill run up in 1779 by the governor, a judge, and 2 Indian affairs officials for luxurious meals and lodging at an Albany tavern, which Grundle calls the original per diem abuse. And, of course, the New York State legislator, George Washington Plunkett, literally wrote the book on political corruption. Plunkett of Tammany Hall, a series of discussions recorded by journalist William Reardon at the beginning of the 20th century. It was Plunkett who famously made the distinction between honest and dishonest graft. Unfortunately, both forms are still alive and well in Albany. Albany may, in fact, be our nation's most consistent epicenter of public corruption since the days of Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr through Roosevelt and right up to today. So why, then, does it feel like we're living in a golden age of graft with the new headlines almost every week about public corruption, arrests, indictments, scandals? Paradoxically, I believe the surge in headlines reflects a change for the better. It's not that people in Albany are more corrupt than ever. It's that we have more and more vigorous cops on the beat than we've ever had before. This current wave of investigations was begun by the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, who has done New Yorkers a great service. But this work is also being done by other federal prosecutors, and I am very pleased to say, by the Office of the Attorney General of the State of New York. By way of background, the Attorney General's office does not have original jurisdiction over public corruption cases. To prosecute these cases, my office has to get a referral from another executive agency. I've asked Governor Cuomo to grant a general referral, a standing order to investigate and prosecute any case of public corruption, which he supported when he was Attorney General, and which as governor he could grant me with the stroke of a pen. My request was denied. And so we took an alternative route, working with our great state controller, Tom DiNapoli, who also has the ability to refer cases to my office. We devised an unprecedented approach that helps overcome this jurisdictional barrier. In 2011, Controller DiNapoli and I formed Operation Integrity, a first-of-its-kind joint task force which uses the controller's power to refer cases involving abuse of public funds to me so that I can prosecute and investigate as Attorney General. This effort has led to more than 60 cases since in the last 3 years, including the indictment of members of the Assembly, members of the New York City Council, the conviction of a sitting state senator, and local officials around the state. This is something that is unprecedented, and I'm very proud to have built the most active public integrity bureau in the history of our office. But ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, more cops on the beat will never be enough. Prosecutors can only respond to the symptoms of a very, very sick system. My fellow reformers, we have to cure the disease, and to do so we must break a pattern in which scandal is followed by outrage, as the dean noted, which is followed by reforms that largely tinker at the margins and a press conference declaring that the problem has been solved, which in turn is followed by a quelling of the outrage, which ultimately is followed by another scandal. Just consider, New York State enacted ethics reforms in 2005 and 2007 and 2011 and again last year. It looks to most of the people of New York, and I spent a lot of time traveling around the state talking to regular people, it looks to the people like one charade after another. Sadly, every time incremental reforms have been called sweeping or groundbreaking, billed as a solution to the problem, those words have been proven false. In fact, the primary impact of many highly touted marginal reforms has been to allow business as usual to continue. Everyone in this room cares deeply about good government. Yet most of us are guilty of being too easily pacified by incremental reforms in the past. That includes me. Ladies and gentlemen, I entered the state Senate as a reformer, and I'm a reformer to this day. Before I was even in the Senate, I was on the board of Citizen Action of New York, fighting for campaign finance reform. I did pro bono legal work for NYPIRG, fighting for transparency at the MTA. And as a senator, I stood with many of you at those press conferences extolling the transformational effect of incremental reforms. Well, I'm through with that. And you should be too. The people of this great state demand comprehensive fundamental reform. They deserve nothing less, and they will accept nothing less. The cases brought by my office and other prosecutors show the path forward if we fail to embrace real reform. More prosecutions and further erosion of public corruption. That is one option. The only other option is to channel public outrage at the ongoing corruption scandals into a movement for comprehensive reform. We have done this before in New York, and we can do it again. And there are many reasons for our colleagues in state government to enact transformational reforms right now. So let me spell out what I believe that would actually look like, and as the Dean said, let's get people a little bit outside of their comfort zone. First, allowing legislators to have outside jobs invites corruption and the perception of corruption. Revising and revising again our system for disclosure of income has proved to be a diversion. Just look back to the joint press release trumpeting the 2011 ethics reform package. You will read about its, quote, unprecedented transparency, end quote, and, quote, strict disclosure requirements, end quote. Well, it really wasn't true then, and it isn't true now. But to me, the solution is just as clear. Outside employment income must be banned. Ladies and gentlemen, in the 21st century, it is impossible to avoid conflicts or the appearance of conflicts if legislators have outside employment. The time has come to end it. In the same vein, we should end per diem payments. Legislators should be reimbursed for their actual costs of travel. Total reimbursement should be capped, and that should be it. Second, to make these reforms work, we have to focus on making public service a profession that our best, brightest, and most honest citizens want to undertake. John Adams famously beseeched his son to enter public service, saying, "If honest men refuse it, others will not." So to attract the best people in government, building on New York's great legacy of outstanding public servants, we have to accompany a ban on outside employment with a very significant salary increase for legislators. I would propose a salary for state legislators that is between what the New York City Council and members of Congress are currently paid, and it should automatically be subject to cost of living increases going forward. This will remove future pay raises from the vicissitudes of Albany sausage making, which treats legislative pay as nothing more than a bargaining chip at the end of every other legislative session. How else do we attract good people into government? Not by weakening reform, but by strengthening it. The same things that will make the legislature a small d democratic institution are the same things that will make it a more attractive career path. A decade ago, a report from the Brennan Center called New York's legislature the most dysfunctional in the nation. And this finding was based in no small part on the dictatorial control that legislative leaders exerted on the process. Since then, very little has changed. It's time to loosen the grip, to move power from the leaders to the members, as many other legislatures have done. Make committees meaningful parts of an open legislative process, and make funding for legislative staff and offices and committee assignments more equitable among members. Give individual legislators more power, and more good people will want to be legislators. And let me make an even more radical suggestion. A game changer that would require a constitutional amendment, but that I would support as a part of a real reform package, including the things that I'm outlining here today. Each legislative term should be 4 years long instead of 2. Ending the 2-year cycle where legislators are engaged in nonstop re-election fundraising and campaigning, will attract more high-quality candidates into government, and it will give the legislature breathing room to focus less on each coming election and more on the serious work of governing. Third, we can't address reform without dealing with the stranglehold that political contributions have on our government. The way we regulate campaign finances in New York provides a wide open door for legalized corruption, a modern-day version of Plunkett's honest graft. And reform is long overdue. The public matching funds and disclosure system has worked well in New York City and in other jurisdictions. It is time to bring public matching funds to New York State elections. The cost of the program is nothing compared to the cost of public corruption, and it is time for us to move that forward. Finally, there are 4 additional changes that must be a part of a comprehensive reform package that addresses the true need to get off this path of scandal, prosecution, and outrage, and a loss of public confidence. Contribution limits should be dramatically reduced, including those for statewide office holders, which are now the highest contribution limits in the country of all the states that have contribution limits. The LLC loophole, referring to limited liability corporations, which allows wealthy interests to funnel limitless amounts to a campaign, must be closed. And we should completely eliminate so-called housekeeping committees, which operate as barely regulated slush funds for political parties and legislative campaigns. Finally, and this is a big one, pay-to-play contributions must be restricted in state campaigns as they are for New York City campaigns. Entities that have business before the state, their executives and those who are paid to lobby on their behalf, should be limited to making extremely modest contributions. Today, they are not in our state elections. So, my friends, this is an ambitious package, but I would urge you that now is the time for us to focus on it. We are 2 weeks away from the first state budget, following a scandal that really did shock the conscience of the state. The governor has proposed to enact reforms through this year's state budget. We should support his leadership in using this perfectly constitutional mechanism. And in fact, I would urge the governor to hold out for even bolder reforms, including the proposals I've outlined tonight. In doing so, he would have the support of both the Constitution and the people of the state of New York. But ladies and gentlemen, and it's very fitting that we're here at a Citizens Union Forum to focus on this, because this moment in New York's history, this moment of conscience-shocking scandal must be a moment that leads to truly transformational reform. Let us commit ourselves to a new 21st century reform movement, building an edifice of reform on the rubble of scandal. And as I noted earlier, we have done this before in New York. Actually, Dick, you all have done this before in New York. And I would call your attention to what happened in the 1930s. In the wake of Judge Samuel Seabury's searing investigation of Tammany Hall, which drove Mayor James Walker from office, the city fusion movement was born. So investigation and prosecution led to a movement for reform, and that's simply the path forward I'm suggesting today. In the 1930s, the coalition of reformers elected Fiorello LaGuardia as reform mayor. They formed the City Fusion Party, which got him elected, and went on to transform New York City's charter in 1936. Citizens Union was a key part of the successful reform movement in the 1930s, and it will be a critical part of the reform movement of the 21st century that we must build if we're to enact real transformational change that New York needs. I know that emotions on these issues now run high. For many legislators, there's a mix of anger at those who have dishonored the institution and anger at outsiders who rail against it. So to the legislators listening, I ask you as colleagues in public service to set aside the instinct to defend the system. You are not being attacked. It's the system that's being attacked, a system that taints all in the government with the misconduct of the few. Let us together summon the pride and the aspirations that young Theodore Roosevelt must have felt when he walked through the doors of the state capitol for the first time. Let us demand a fresh start, and let us deliver a state government that truly serves the public interest. Thank you.
Even though he's left, thank you, Attorney General Schneiderman. Greatly appreciate your laying out a full-throated and bold set of proposals to fight corruption in Albany and to reform our political system. Before we get into the panel discussion, which is the next part of our civic conversation tonight, I do want to just do a couple housekeeping notes. For those of you who want to connect to the Wi-Fi, there was a document outside with the Wi-Fi password, so you can sign on as a guest of the New York Law School's Wi-Fi system. I want to thank the tremendous staff at Citizens Union who went to great efforts to put together this wonderful event, particularly Chelsea Schuster. Where's Chelsea? She's probably, there she is right there. And Amy and Rachel and Peggy of the policy staff. I also want to draw your attention to some of the materials that were handed out as you entered the room. Citizens Union last week came out with a very comprehensive set of reforms as well that dealt with elected official compensation, strengthening ethics enforcement, reforming campaign finance, and also addressing the lump sums in the budget and ending the use of the budget as a policy-making opportunity. They're detailed, and you should have them stapled to the program. The other thing is, and we'll talk about this throughout the evening, is the list of reforms that Attorney General Schneiderman made reference to that have been tried and implemented, many of them successful in that they got the camel's nose under the tent, so to speak, but not the kind of comprehensive reform that I think the situation now demands. When you also came in, there were your programs, attached to your programs were little index cards. This will be the opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So we would encourage you to write down any questions that may come to you during this panel discussion and then pass them to the center aisle. And about 7:30, we will pick them up and organize them so that we have an opportunity to have the audience questions be addressed by the panel. So in addition to, obviously, Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, we're fortunate to have three panelists here tonight with us. The fourth that we had hoped to have with us, Ellen Bybin, who is the former and first executive director of JACOP, the Joint Commission on Public Ethics, that was created as a result of the 2011 state law. Unfortunately, had to pull out at the last minute because of a personal family matter. She sends her regrets. But we do have three wonderful panelists with us. As announced earlier, Richard Briffault is a professor of legislation at Columbia Law School. His research, writing, and teaching focus on state and local government law. He is chair of the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board, has served as a member of the famed New York's Moreland Commission that was formed to investigate public corruption, and is a reporter for the American Law Institute's Project on Principles of Government Ethics. He's a co-author of several articles, and as mentioned earlier, he's a vice chair of the Citizens Union Board, and we're very fortunate to have him here with us tonight. Also joining him is the Honorable Richard Brodsky, a former 14-term New York State Assembly member from Westchester, and now senior fellow at Demos. He was while there, he was chair of the Assembly Committee on Corporations, Authorities, and Commissions, where he authored the historic 2009 Public Authorities Reform Act, a sweeping reform of all New York's 700 public authorities. He's since stepping down as a member of the legislature, he's been quoted and made many media appearances and public appearances, still championing the things that he believed in strongly in Albany, showing how committed he is to this reform movement. We're glad to have him here. Filling out the roster is Jennifer Rodgers, who's the Executive Director of the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity at Columbia Law School, a partnership between the law school and New York City's Department of Investigation. Prior to joining the commission, prior to joining the center, Jennifer worked at the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District, where she served as in numerous capacities, including Deputy Chief Appellate Attorney and the chief of the Organized Crime Unit. And so we're very pleased to have her here as well. So as the program lays out, we're going to focus on some rather broad questions and try in the remaining hour and 10 minutes that we have, drill down on some of the big issues confronting us and talk a little bit about what the Attorney General has proposed here tonight as solutions. But we're going to begin in talking about how one defines corruption here in New York State, and also what is the nature and the extent of corruption in Albany, and the ethics issues that we've been so overwhelmed by. And once we begin to identify the problem in a little bit more detail, we'll start to focus on some of the solutions that have been proposed and how we can fix Albany's corruption problem and hope that we can encourage state lawmakers to earn back our trust. So I'm just going to join the panelists over here instead of standing up. We're going to give the panelists 90 seconds just to kind of make some opening comments and remarks, and then I have a number of questions that I'm going to pose them in our conversation. So, Richard.
Just go down the row? Okay. All right, thanks. Thank you, Dick, and thanks to the CU staff for organizing this civic conversation, and to Anthony Crowell and New York Law School for hosting us, to the Attorney General for his speaking and for his very thoughtful and comprehensive proposals. And I think most of all, actually, thanks to all of you for being here. An attentive and engaged, maybe outraged public is ultimately the best protection against corruption. It is said that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. I think it's also the price of government integrity. So thank you for being focused on this. When I think about the corruption issue, I somehow think about it in terms of the whodunits, crime stories or detective stories. And what is it that Hercule Poirot or Sherlock Holmes is looking for in a mystery like that? And it always turns into three things, right? Means, motive, and opportunity. Public officials have the means. That is to say, they have the access to public power in government. That's a power that can be used for great and important and valuable public purposes, but because they're also fallible human beings, it can be used for private ends too. Like all people, they have the motive to use the resources at their disposal for private ends. It could be their re-election, or it could be the well-being of themselves and their families, things that we honor in private people when they try and advance the well-being of themselves and their family. And unless we place appropriate constraints on them or give them alternatives to the misuse of public resources for personal benefit, they will be tempted to use the opportunities that we give them. The Attorney General has already referred to George Washington Plunkett, the famous Tammany Hall politician and philosopher, a man who invented the term honest graft. His most famous quote is, "I see my opportunities and I took them." I think the issue for us is to focus on some of these opportunities. So what should we as citizens be doing about this, about the means, motive, and opportunity? I think the means is not really something we can change. The means of access to government power is not going to change. That's what it means to be in government, to be able to work the levers of government, to do things good or maybe not so good. But I think we can work on motive and opportunity. In some ways, the AG's proposals sort of fit with this. We can work on motive by reforming the campaign finance system, by providing a public funding program that will seek to reduce the motive to seek large private campaign contributions in order to run for re-election. We can also address motive by, as the AG suggested, reforming the government salary structure and thinking about the kinds of rules reforms that makes the public service of holding office a reward in itself for all of its members, not just for the 3 men in a room or the opportunity to get private gain. And I think most of all, we can work on the opportunity by using our laws to reduce the opportunity for misconduct through limits on outside income, through real disclosure, including the real transparency, through limits on the personal use of campaign funds, limits on the abuse of the per diem system, closing other loopholes in the campaign finance system, having real transparency on government spending so that slush funds are a thing of the past, and demanding real enforcement agencies, our own New York agencies, not just the U.S. Attorney, who has done such a great job, and real penalties for misconduct. These rules, of course, are not just about the legislature. The legislature gets a lot of the grief, but they're not the only people in Albany. These rules should apply to all public officials. But I think if we think about this as a whodunit, and we think about motive and opportunity, we can get to some of the details later, but I think that may move us along.
Jennifer?
Thanks for having me. Good evening. I want to do a quick plug for my center, if I might. We're a relatively new public integrity center up at Columbia Law School. And if you're all interested in public integrity issues, which I imagine you are, being here tonight, you should check us out. We can be found at law.columbia.edu/Kathy. Is my mic not on? Is my mic on? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Your mic.
Okay. All right, a little closer. /CAPI, CAPI, and we do lots of programs, conferences, and other events with the main goal being to help public integrity professionals be more effective. So please look for us. We have a big conference coming up next month called Global Cities, where we're bringing together 12 to 15 cities from around the world to talk about shared corruption challenges and successes. It's going to be really interesting. It's free. You can register on our website today if you like. So that's my plug. So talking about corruption, we were asked to kind of define corruption at the outset, and I agree with everything Richard just said, so I guess I could stop there. But I think of it in slightly different terms. I kind of put things into buckets. So I thought about 3 buckets when you're talking about defining corruption. One, of course, is illegal conduct that actually is prohibited by the criminal laws. You're talking about things like bribery and embezzlement, stealing public funds. There's then the second bucket, which is conduct that's not technically illegal. It's not against the criminal statutes, but it is still unethical because it violates ethics codes and regulations that are actually set out, and that would be something like giving your brother a job because he's your brother, or taking a lavish gift from someone who's doing business before your agency, that sort of thing. And then there's a third bucket of behavior that's actually technically legal and technically not violating any particular code, but still I think is corruption because it really is, at the end of the day, it is taking advantage of a public position for private gain, and that is things like the pay-to-play things, right? It's accepting a big campaign donation, knowing that you're expected to then behave in a way, taking a public action that's favorable to your donor, or perhaps taking money from an outside employer, knowing that the clients of that firm are only, you're only going to get that money because you're expected to take some action favorable to them. So obviously in the first 2 categories, we want to enforce those prohibitions as best we can, identify what's going on and stop it the best we can. And in the third category, it's really a matter of where we want to draw the lines. And these lines are changing all the time. We're constantly passing new laws. We are putting forward new ethical regulations, and so the issue is, where do we want to move the lines? And as Richard just said, I think clearly the Attorney General and most of us here want to move those lines towards greater prohibitions on some of these things that create conflicts of interest in our public officials. And again, it's not just elected officials; it's really all government employees. So that's what I think about when I think about corruption, and I know we're going to continue to talk about it this evening, so I'll pass it over to Richard.
Well, thank you, and thank you for allowing me to sit with such distinguished colleagues, and thank you, Dick, for leading Citizens Union to its continuing concern about whatever it is what we're talking about tonight. And I say that with some advisedness because I think I can be most helpful by congratulating Citizens Union for really starting a civic conversation. It doesn't exist right now. And to point out that with respect to real change, however that may come, there's almost no discussion going on anywhere. There's a set of cartoonish descriptions of reality. There's a set of genuine concerns. There's a set of outrageous behaviors. And it's been very difficult to sort of figure out what you're going to do, especially if you're in one of the decision-maker positions in Albany. So let me, with that, trying to be helpful in that term, say this. I understand what illegal corruption is. It's a violation of a law or code, mail fraud, indictments, don't require much more than violation of a code. That we know it when we see it. Then there is, I would say, a second bucket, and that is unethical stuff. Stuff that offends some inchoate sense that that's wrong. I don't know if Shelley Silver violated a law. I don't know. I do know that even if it's not illegal, it's not right. And if you divide the debate in between those two, it may be that we can get a functional discussion going that actually helps people decide what it is they're going to do. Now, let me add two things. One, there are other ideas that no one's talked about. Let me rephrase that. There are other ideas. Earlier today, I suggested that we create an inspector general for the legislature, much the way you have an inspector general for the executive branch. I suggested a fiduciary oath. That is to say, some sort of oath for statewide officials that goes beyond the question of obey the law, but goes to the question of do the right thing, which seems to me to be equally important. And I urge that in this discussion, we try not to conflate our genuine concern for three men in a room with taking of bribes. Citizens Union published a very important paper showing that in the legislature over the last 15 years, I believe, Dick, there have been 28 unfortunate, legal-ish things. Some people were forced out before they were indicted. Some people were indicted and went away. Some people were convicted. About half of those were gropers. About a third of them were bribe takers. And about a third or a little less, whatever's left, was other stuff. It's about 5% of the legislature. It's appalling. On the other hand, in the last 15 years, 50% of the controllers of the state of New York, 1/3 of the governors, and 1/3 of the attorneys general, if you want to count Elliot Spitzer twice. And yet the focus is on the legislature. Okay, I understand politics and I understand reality, and I understand wrongdoing when I see it. But it seems to me that the trick here is to decide how you get at what's illegal, how you get at what's unethical that isn't illegal. And let me finish with a story. About 20 years ago, a governor of the state of New York said to me, I will give you $20,000 in your pocket, personal money, Richard Brodsky's money, if you will vote for a bill that I want to introduce and pass, and I don't have the votes for. The governor's name was George Pataki, an honest, decent, hardworking, thoughtful, and effective governor of the state of New York. And the bill was a pay raise. And he would vote for sign the pay raise bill if I voted for a bill that said if your budget's late, you don't get paid. It's not criminal. It's not even unethical. It's political. It's political. So a real engaged discussion of these issues has to some extent, set aside the outrage. Start asking very hard, precise questions of vocabulary, values, and practical politics. And if that can happen, I think Citizens Union will continue to be the beacon of conversation and thought about these very difficult and problematic issues.
Thank you. Very good introductory remarks. Let's talk about how corruption actually takes place in Albany. I mean, Richard, you laid out a couple of different examples. There is the act of the individual in misbehaving, whether it's illegal or not. There is the system that seems to allow for misconduct or tolerates misdeeds. And then there's the culture, the individual, the system, and the culture. How do they interact with one another? Is it about the individuals? Is it about the system? How do we get this culture of corruption that has the Citizens Union.
What is the culture of corruption? Explain to me what you mean so I can help answer the question.
28 legislators. You just laid it out. 28 legislators in the last 15 years have been forced from office because of misconduct or criminal activity. You mentioned a comptroller. You mentioned
Okay.
So, I mean, is that the system? Is that just random individuals?
Big issues.
Or is there a culture in Albany that is allowing this kind of activity to take place?
I'm having a hard time with the question, and that's my problem, not anybody else's. The big decisions that Albany makes, school aid, how much your school district gets, mayoral control of the schools, tax policy generally, with some exceptions, environmental protection, reform of state authorities, healthcare things, are simply not corrupt processes. The things that matter most in the daily lives of the citizenry are not generally the outcome of a corrupt process. They may be a wrong process, and they may be bad results, but no one is paying off anybody to get more money for schools in the budget. So if you're looking at the governance decisions and the governance institutions and the practices, I think it becomes useful to distinguish those from the thieves. The great bulk of members of the legislature, even the great bulk of governors, are not corrupt. And yet we are drawn like moths to this notion of the choice is illegal corruption or legal graft. There's a problem in Albany with thieves and scoundrels. There is a problem in Albany about what we do about our school system. They are generally unrelated problems. So if you're asking me if the outcomes of government are the consequence of a culture of corruption, I'd say no.
So let's take Assemblymember William Boylan, who got tripped up yet again for what was kind of something outlandish in that he was actually trying to solicit a bribe to pay for his defense costs for the first charge of bribery. And he actually got caught and convicted. Is that his fault? Or is there a climate in Albany?
It ain't my fault.
No, it's not. No.
And the answer is, yeah, it's his fault if he's convicted.
But is there a systemic problem that allows that kind of behavior to take place?
Systemic. The problem, whatever its size, is too big. There's too much going on. We ought to change enforcement practices and laws to reflect that. But the system of deciding the big picture issue, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you all, maybe Citizens Union believes that those outcomes are the consequence of a corrupt system. I've been wrong before, and I don't sit here as the possessor of all truth. But
Richard, Briffault. I mean,
there's three of us up here, including you.
Right, that's right. There are. Richard, is it?
Want to change your name? Oh no. Okay.
Is it a problem of the individual? Is it a problem of the system? Is it a culture? What?
I feel like I'm taking the SAT, and the right answer is D, all of the above. I mean, there's a bunch of things going on here. There are obviously some problem individuals, which where there would be in any system. I think the deeper problem is kind of the temptations that the system presents, which is a lot of this, I think, relates to the campaign finance system. So the other Richard was talking about education reform, sure, but you also get things like the use of tax breaks to provide incentives for the construction of new housing. Well, there's a lot of the real estate industry that's making very large campaign contributions to members of the legislature. The tax break may or may not be good public policy, and there's a real debate about that in the housing development community. But what there's no debate is that many members of the legislature are receiving very large campaign contributions with people with a direct financial interest in having this tax credit exist and be renewed. It makes it harder for them to make the right decision, which is decision on the merits, which is the decision based on their sincere view as to what's in the public interest. It makes it harder for them to make that decision, and it makes it harder for us to tell whether they're making that decision based on the merits or because of the temptation to get some money for a re-election campaign or for another election campaign. So I think that's the part that's the system. the part that there may be a second part of the system to the extent that these things exist and are not stopped. So that there is always a sense that when somebody gets away with something, other people are tempted to do it. Not everybody, and I agree, certainly. Although one has the sense that the legislature is kind of like a high crime neighborhood. Even a high crime neighborhood, not everybody is a criminal. Far from it. And I shouldn't say the legislature. You are correct. It is Albany. It is not a legislature-only issue. And
but you did.
Right. But I did. Well, there's more of them, for one thing. So they tend to dominate the headlines. But you're absolutely right. It's the number of people there. But once you have people getting away with things and not being caught, like the former controller who eventually got caught, but it took a while. Once you get people getting away with things and not being caught, or even in some of the sexual harassment cases where everyone knew about the behavior, but it was people looked to one side. Once people are getting away with things and not getting caught or enforced against, it's tempted to other people to slip a little and to have the per diem account or to dip into the campaign fund for personal use if there's nobody watching or if they don't think there's anybody watching.
So Jennifer, I mean, your center is looking at the root causes of corruption, I would imagine. I mean, is it just a bunch of individuals who have gone bad, or is there some systemic contribution to this that creates this problem?
So the way I think about it is that there are really three kinds of people, and this is in any institution, not just the legislature, but any government agency or anywhere, any group of people. You know, you have the people who are incorruptible, right? They're so good, they're so honest, they're never going to do anything wrong, the real do-gooders of the world. It's a small group of people. You have a small group of people who are totally corrupt, just criminals. They're going to do bad things no matter what. They're going to take every opportunity offered. They're going to make their own opportunities. Those are the bad seeds. And you can't do much about either of those two groups. And then there is the vast middle group of most people who could go either way, depending on the opportunities presented to them for corruption and the risks associated with acting corruptly. And that's the group, the big middle group that you're aiming at with corruption reform, because those are the people that you can influence. And so you want to lessen the opportunities for corruption that are available, and you want to increase the risks associated with being caught acting corruptly. And one of the problems that is happening with the legislature is that its processes are so opaque, it's kind of hard to impose some of the transparency that would increase the risks of getting caught. We'll talk, I think, a little later about enforcement, but while there is some great enforcement going on, I mean, you can't catch everybody for everything, so that's not a foolproof mechanism. And in terms of lowering the opportunities for corruption, that's really hard to do. In an executive branch agency, from the top, you can just set some rules, you can set some codes, you can do these things more easily. In the legislature, by and large, you have to pass legislation in order to impose those sorts of rules, and no one wants to do that to themselves. So I think it is a unique institution that doesn't lend itself as well as other institutions to the sorts of rules and regulations that will lower those corruption opportunities. And also, there are some distinct issues with the legislature in terms of how opaque it is that also hurt on the enforcement side in terms of increasing the risks. So that's what I see as kind of some systemic issues that influence that problem.
Let's talk for a minute a little bit about the role of ethics oversight and enforcement in Albany and the various actors that are involved in that effort. There is this, Richard, you may not buy into this idea of the culture of corruption, but there is a veil of secrecy. I mean, Jennifer just referred to that much of what goes on in the legislature is not as transparent as it can be and should be, and that a lot of the stuff that if there was more disclosure, if there was more transparency and a more effective legislatively functioning legislature that conducted business more out in the open without everything being decided in advance, that maybe there would be less opportunity for misdeeds and unethical conduct. But part of the problem has been, I think, in Albany that the legislature has self-policed itself, and that it was only until 2011 when the recent state ethics laws were passed that allowed for joint oversight for the first time of both the executive and the legislative branch. Do you think JCOPE has been an effective mechanism in bringing this first ever joint oversight? Richard, why don't I start with you? Richard Briffault.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, you go.
It's one of those things where it may be too soon to tell. As you point out, it's only been around about 3 years. They did one, I think, very valuable investigation of the Vito Lopez case, in particular the role of the Assembly leadership in not effectively addressing that case, to put it mildly, and I think that was actually a very, very useful study. I think JCOPE and entities like that are handicapped by the way they're set up. I mean, and this is not unique to New York. It's actually very hard to come up with oversight mechanisms that deal with politics, that deal with ethical conduct in the legislature or elections or lobbying that are simultaneously kind of effective and not partisan. And too often the tendency is to make them effectively bipartisan, which means one side is going to block the other side from effective action. We see this at the national level and we see it at the state. So JCOPE is structured in a very cumbersome way. Basically, almost everybody in Albany gets to make an appointment, and then they almost all have to agree. All the appointees have to agree before they can actually bring a case. So it's not designed to be effective. And I think I want to leave it at that. It's hard to tell whether it actually is effective, but if it turns out to be effective, it won't be because it was built that way.
Right. Jennifer?
Do you want to talk about the prosecutor's office?
I mean, your familiarity with JCOPE and this idea of the change from legislative self-policing to joint public oversight. Is it working?
I don't know. I don't know. I agree with Richard. The way it's set up is far from ideal. I mean, they're not doing very much yet that is of their own initiative. They've hopped on to a number of things, like most recently the Sheldon Silver matter, after someone else here, the U.S. Attorney, has started the effort, or I guess Moreland started the effort, and the U.S. Attorney's Office also. So I don't know yet. It doesn't seem yet that it's working in the way that we would want. So there's work to be done.
So,
the other Richard.
The other Richard.
I don't want to be the other Richard.
Then I'll be the other Richard.
Okay. I don't know. I think there's wisdom in not knowing, but I don't see that enforcement is in the end going to do much to stop a thief from being a thief. I do think there are some elements that are not transparent enough, not the ones you mentioned, interestingly enough. But if you look at where the problems arose, they arose in the member item process. They arose when not-for-profit community organizations were funded by people who then had self-dealings with them. And if you believe the allegations in the Silver case, where money set aside for health care were used as part of a process to privately benefit. Those things really need to be shown to the public much, much, much more clearly. Whether JCOPE is the instrumentality for that or not, I don't know. But if you think you've got a problem in the legislature with the letting of contracts, why don't you walk over to the public authorities or the Department of, or the MTA? And yet, and I think this is where I'm going to be cast tonight. I'm not exactly comfortable, but what the hell, I'll take the role. All we seem to talk about is the legislature. How do you know that the great bulk of legislators are easily swayed down the path, the primrose path?
I didn't say easily.
Okay.
I said the vast majority of people in any organization, including the legislature, are amenable to being swayed by opportunities and risks.
I think that's a good way to lead your life, except if you know the players. The fact of the matter is, I'll sit here and tell you that the great bulk, whether that's 80% or 95%, is irrelevant data, are not thieves and aren't tempted. Well, let me rephrase that. Even if they're tempted, they don't do it. So, look, there are enormous ethical problems coming out of Albany. But they are, as I believe, as Richard Briffault described it, the campaign finance system. where millions move back and forth. And if you think the forces that are writing the big checks are doing it because they like us or really want us to exercise our own independent judgment, no. The unions have an outcome. The charter school hedge fund guys have an outcome. The real estate guys have an outcome. If the concern is money is driving results, then the bulk of the system is legal and unethical, and if you want to include that, corrupt. But if your concern is people taking public money and putting it in their pocket, Jacob can handle that.
Just wanted to just add two things. One is that issue down there is too modest to acknowledge he's actually been a major leader in trying to have more transparency and controls on the public authorities, which are the dark continent of state government.
He said it was too modest. That's true.
And you are shining a lot. You've done a lot to shine a lot of light on that. I also think that I haven't seen the details, but your idea for some kind of auditor general or inspector general, somebody, I don't know what it's going to look like, and I may disagree with how to set it up, but some kind of outside figure who can actually really review the books of the legislature. I think it would go far, not just to maintain honesty, but to give public confidence in that. And I think a lot of what you're hearing is as much about shaken confidence as, the proven cases, whether they're a lot or a few, whatever they are, have led to more of a crisis of confidence. And I think some of this is about preventing the recurrence of future cases, and some of this is also about restoring confidence.
So, in addition to JACO, there are other enforcement entities in Albany. There's the Inspector General for the executive branch. There are county district attorneys who have authority over local corruption. The Attorney General mentioned earlier that he has responsibility when it's delegated to him from the governor, and then all of a sudden there's this U.S. attorney who seems to have had great success in waking the public up to the attention of corruption and in pressing charges. He's the only one who's really kind of uncovered it, other than what Jacob did.
And the other U.S. attorney, the one whose nomination is hanging by a thread in Washington, she was a major figure in putting at least one state senator away.
Correct.
That I can think of.
Loretta Lynch. So why have we had to rely really upon the U.S. attorney to be the one, whether it's from the Eastern District or from the Southern District, when we have all these other cops on the beat in Albany? What is inherently wrong with our system of oversight and enforcement that has not addressed the issue of unethical conduct or corruption, that has allowed the U.S. attorney to come in and do what he or she has done?
Sure. So the two U.S. attorneys in the city, Eastern and Southern Districts, have done an extraordinary job of prosecuting public corruption cases, both at the state and local levels as well as the federal level. I don't think it's time for questions yet. They have really good people. They've done a lot of great cases. They can't do everything. We really do need our 62 district attorneys to step up. I was so pleased to hear the Attorney General talk in such strong terms about his reform package. I've met with his Public Integrity Bureau chief. They are dedicated and interested in working harder on corruption as well. So I think we're going to continue to see good things out of the Attorney General's office. We will continue to see good cases out of Southern and Eastern districts. The problem with the local level prosecutors, with two exceptions, are, they're smaller offices. They don't have a lot of resources. They're largely reactive because they deal largely with street crime and other things, burglaries, purse snatchings, assaults and so on that happen, and they have to respond to them. And so these investigations into public corruption are oftentimes complicated, white-collar, like financial investigations that take up a lot of resources and expertise. They're hard for district attorneys to do. They also don't have as many tools as they would like. Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance has been very vocal about trying to get more tools, more two procedural changes he's proposed, and a number of substantive changes to the law to try to give local prosecutors better ways to fight corruption. But, as I said, other than Cy Vance in Manhattan, who has a lot of resources in his office and the ability to do these cases, and Ken Thompson in Brooklyn, who ran without his party's support, really, and so said just openly that he doesn't owe anybody anything, and he's happy to go after corrupt politicians for sure. And his office has done a number of corruption cases over the year, partnering with the Department of Investigation. So other than those two district attorneys' offices, we really haven't seen much enforcement on the local DA level. And it's hard to see it changing because of the tools and resources issues, but, we need to do some further work there for sure.
Richard?
I'm all for prosecutors. You could reduce the number of thieves from 10 over the last 15 years to 0, and the fundamental political dynamic whereby the wealthy, through their legal campaign contributions, control the outcome would not change.
Right.
And admittedly, Preet Bharara has been very, very vocal on these issues, as you all know, and he will say the same thing. He will say, look, we're doing what we can. We think we're doing a good job, but it's one piece of the puzzle. I mean, they're just one piece of the prosecution puzzle. And then you talk about preventing corruption and trying to educate people about what's required of them, what's expected of them, and what they should be doing. That's a whole other piece that prosecutors have nothing to do with, and it's a really, really vital piece. So they're the first ones to say that they do what they can, but that they're only a small piece of the problem.
The Moreland Commission report actually addressed some of this. The preliminary report, we never got to get another one. And there's a section on it that deals with the problems that the state DAs brought to our attention, which is, in fact, Jennifer referred to some of the procedural tools. There are a handful of things in terms of both the definition of what a bribe is, in terms of what has to be proven, and the ability to take evidence from witnesses, what's called immunity, that is more generous or is more supportive of prosecutions in federal law than in state law. And the Association of New York State DAs has repeatedly sought to get the law in New York changed in these areas and has so far been unsuccessful. We endorsed their recommendation. We basically repeated their recommendations and endorsed it. The legislature last year, I think, stiffened some of the penalties for public corruption, but did not actually change the definition or change the procedural rules.
So let's talk about some of the solutions that have been put on the table, both by the governor, the attorney general today. Richard Brodsky, you put out some ideas. Citizens Union has put some out. The issue of compensation for the legislature. The idea that somehow we should limit outside income. Governor Cuomo is not necessarily proposing a cap. The attorney general wants to ban it. Others, like Citizens Union, have proposed a cap, also proposing, strict prohibitions on the source of income that can be earned. Also supporting greater disclosure. What can be done to fight corruption in Albany as it relates to outside income and legislative compensation? Where do you stand on these proposals? What do you think?
When I choose
okay. I don't think there's any relation between illegal activity, thievery, and salary levels. If $79,000 isn't enough to stop you from being a thief, $150,000 isn't enough to stop you from being a thief. Second of all, I think the salary should be raised. I think it's a scandal that the leading good government voices in the state, with the exception sometimes of Citizens Union, have used legislative pay raises as a hammer to get things that they otherwise want, even if the things are good. As to outside income, the notion that only earned outside income is ethically offensive puzzles me. I cannot find an ethical distinction between the conflict caused by being, in this case, this is an actual case in the legislature, a guy who owns and operates 3 funeral homes, and the guy who owns the corporation that owns 3 funeral homes. If outside income is an ethical problem, then there is no distinction between earned and unearned income. Yet most of the proposals, governors included, assume that you can't have a job. That'll cure it if your trust fund has only IBM in it, and IBM wants $1 billion worth of concessions, which they got. So, legislative pay compensation, important, unrelated to corruption as far as I can see. But if you are going to go down that road, try to think in an ethically consistent manner. And if you're going to say it's only jobs, explain to me why unearned income is not an ethical problem if you're getting big money from the same guys that don't have a job there.
I have a slightly different perspective on this. I think that Richard is focused a lot on the word thief. And I think that over-dramatizes and at the same time kind of blurs what's going on. The problem is not the thievery, although some of that happens. The problem is the temptation when what you're doing in the legislature, or as the governor, or the attorney general, or the controller, could also benefit your private pocket. So if, for example, you have an affiliation with a law firm that does a lot of personal injury work, it may affect your votes on laws that would make personal injury litigation more or less successful. If you have an outside practice that does a lot of real estate tax appeals, it may affect your vote on laws that would change the rules governing real estate tax appeals. It's not being a thief. It's being tempted. And that's, I think, is by conflict of interest. Now, how do we address that? One way is disclosure, and I think disclosure is very useful. I think disclosure is important to give some transparency, but disclosure actually doesn't necessarily stop anything. In fact, it doesn't stop anything unless there is a big public outcry, and one of the problems that we have is whatever outcry there is, it doesn't seem to show up on Election Day. So it may be that what we really do need to have is some restrictions on the outside in addition to disclosure. And I think it's important to disclose those IBM shares for the person who's voting on an IBM tax cut to see if there's going to be some public outcry. But in addition, it's useful to have some actual constraints. And the real problem here is walking the line between reducing the temptations to conflict of interest and recognizing that legislators are human beings too, and other public officials, that they live in the real world, that they had lives and other things and before they went into public office, and we'll have them afterwards. And we don't want to feel like going into a monastery to become a public official. So I think that's where the earned income, unearned income line sort of maps. It may not be perfect. We might want to try restrictions on earned income for a while and see if it works. But there's both the time temptation of earning that earned income, but there's also the fact that it's more, I think, on people's minds, that this could have a direct impact on what I'm earning. So I think that's why there's, I think, a strong case for doing here. Congress has a rule that caps outside earned income at 15% of what members of Congress are paid. And that strikes me as a reasonable proposal. There's no magic at 15%, but something like that would reduce the temptation to be thinking about how a particular law might affect your outside income.
So, Jennifer, some argue, as we've heard, that all that's really needed is greater disclosure of income. That if the income that's earned is disclosed more publicly than it is right now, that will solve the problem. That there is no need for caps or limits, that this is a part-time legislature, that people should be still allowed to have outside business interests. What do you think?
Well, I have to say I was so glad to hear the Attorney General come out in favor of a full-time legislature proposal, because no one had really done that yet, actually some people had a little bit, but I'm glad that someone of his stature is talking about it, because, that's what Congress is. Congress is a full-time legislature. You can earn if you're not providing services, including a fiduciary relationship, earn up to 15% of whatever the top paid legislator is, but that's not a lot. And I feel like as a New Yorker, I ought to have a full-time legislature. I feel like my elected representatives ought to work full-time in my interests, and so, just like Congress. So I'm happy that this proposal has been made. I want to know a little bit more about how it would work. The problem with disclosures is they get fuzzy. The language that was in place or is currently in place isn't strong enough. It's also not very readily comprehensible, I don't think, to the average person. And yet the proposal that the governor has made that's in, they're talking about now, I don't think is any clearer. And I don't think it's any better. So I think it's pretty hard to come up with disclosure language that is going to be perfect. I guess Alaska and D.C. have been mentioned as examples that have clearer language. But at the end of the day, I'm not 100% there yet, but I'm looking at the ban on outside employment, or at least allowing just a specific amount in it, because, I want my legislature to work for me. I think that's a reasonable request.
And Richard Brodsky, you were up there and you worked more than full-time as a legislator. What do your colleagues think of, or what would you think your colleagues think of limiting outside income either through greater prohibitions of sources or an outright cap?
Because of the economics of the state, it's really a downstate issue. I mean, if you live here in Tribeca, try living on $79,000 a year. If you live in Oneonta, you might be able to get by. The real problem that the members talk about is what do you do about spouses and children? And if you're going to, you can only make 15% of whatever the salary is, but your wife or your spouse can be a lawyer or a restaurant owner or whatever and make whatever, and that somehow is going to reduce the opportunity or the sense of private benefit. This is hard stuff to make work, and it's very, it's very hard when you're dealing with this kind of thing to find something that would actually do what I think we all want to do. You can't legislate morality, and the problem in Albany, in my view, is essentially an ethics and morality problem. And it's being turned into a legal problem, and that's going to get us all nowhere, in your
op-ed today, you basically argued for greater disclosure.
No. I argued for a fiduciary oath. I argued for putting your hand up to say, I won't self-deal. I don't know what happens if you break that oath. But by God, people ought to be made aware that they have that obligation. I also talked about an inspector general. That's way more than disclosure. And I also talked about changing the constitutional requirements for the budget. The legislature has no constitutional power to amend the budget. That's like Putin, Duma. We're the Duma of the United States of America. Those kinds of things. Look, I fear I complicate things and take what is a clear sense of outrage, which I share, and end up telling you it's all very muddy and difficult. We're not going to really be able to do anything. That's not my point. My point is that we're really going to have to think much more rigorously about this, which is why I was so glad, as I said before, to be invited. Because I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I'm damn sure that a bar on outside income for a member is not going to stop the corrupt guy from having his wife go out and do the same thing.
So we're getting a couple questions here from the audience. One of them is, how much of the problem of Albany corruption is attributable to three men in a room, in which the legislative leaders have disproportionate power and budget, and legislative decisions are made by those three behind closed doors? What does that, how does that system of three men in the room contribute to to misconduct in Albany by being so secretive?
By corruption or misconduct?
Misconduct or corruption?
That me?
Yeah, any of you.
Until recently, I would have said almost none. You don't like three men in a room? Go down to Washington. There the members are empowered. The reason I've changed my view on that is that if the facts in the Silver case are proven that the HICRA pot was used for essentially a private purpose, then the power of the Speaker over those pots of money is a real problem. It's opportunity and motive and everything rolled into one. But the notion that 3 men in a room is evidence of dysfunction has never been established to me. Yeah, that's what I said. Let me say it again. The evidence that it has never been established that the 3 men in a room is an evidence of dysfunction. You need a negotiator. You need a negotiator. The chaos is not. It's not the only alternative to 3 men in a room, but it's a risk. The Democratic Conference at Albany has Trotskyites and neo-crypto-fascists in it. And yet we got to do a school aid run. You want to set that out for a public debate? You'll never get anything going. Democracies were never set up as debating societies. They were democracies, and public debate matters. But as long as the members in the end control the outcome, give their negotiators instructions, the notion of 3 men in the room is a sign of dysfunction ought to be argued by one of my 2 colleagues here, not by me. Richard?
It depends on what you mean by dysfunction. And that's also, I think, you want to separate dysfunction from corruption. It's not clear to me that it's how it connects to corruption. The only thing I can think of is that with the 3 men in a room, and they have always been men, so which is why we're using 3 men in a room and not 3 people in a room. Well, who was the woman in the room?
Andrew Stewart Cousins.
Was she ever actually in the room?
Yes, she was.
Okay. I think she's banging on the door right now.
Now she is, but she had.
I sort of wonder what happens to the other. What is it? 149, and the Senate keeps changing. Whatever 149 and 62 adds up to 211. Well, if they had nothing to do, idle hands are the devil's playthings. And one concern is the sense that that many members may feel that they don't have much of a stake in what's going on and may look for other opportunities. But I actually see that as much of a problem in terms of corruption as the power of the leaders. In terms of dysfunction, it really does turn on what you want. And I think, Richard makes a good point. They can, if you look at the polarization and gridlock in Congress, you kind of almost want 3 men in a room or 3 people in a room in Washington to get something done there. I would just as soon not have another debt crisis. On the other hand, it is inconsistent with a lot of our notions of transparency and deliberation. And so maybe there needs to be more transparency and more deliberation before the 3 people walk into the room. And I think part of the problem is that the committees don't meet. Everything is negotiated in the final days of the session. 500 bills are resolved in 3 days. It's as much the timetable and the entire process that funnels very sharply into those 3 people in the room as the 3 people in the end bargaining it all out. I don't know how many people have. I just saw Hamilton, the new Lin-Manuel Miranda play, and there's a wonderful song in it called "The Room Where It Happens," which is the room where Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and Madison hammer out the deal whereby the national government absorbs the state debts and the capital gets moved to Washington. And you kind of have Aaron Burr skulking around, basically wishing he was in the room. But you're kind of told it wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have had the deal unless the 3 of them were having dinner together behind closed doors. Sometimes you need that, but that happened after a protracted period of open debate in the Senate in Washington in it wasn't Washington, it was in Philadelphia in the 1790s. And we may need some combination of open hearings, open deliberation, real process, and then eventually, when we've got 2 chambers and 2 branches of government, and in a sense 3 chambers, executive, Senate, and Assembly, some process to actually work it all out.
So I haven't seen Hamilton yet, but it sounds like, when I was a young lawyer, I was told I should take up golf because, then you can golf with the men, and then you really kind of can get involved in what's really going on and what's important. But here's how I think the three men issue links to corruption, and I can't talk about the dysfunction issue because I'm not an expert on kind of how things are done up in the legislature in Albany, but it's the secrecy, right? It's the secrecy. You can't tell in this system who's responsible for what's being done, what's being pushed. When a bill is passed, you don't know, you don't have any idea who supported it and who was behind it, and that both, so you have kind of increased opportunities for corruption or unethical behavior because you know it's the secrecy thing, so you're never going to get tagged for having really pushed that particular position or piece of legislation, and at the same time it lowers the risks of getting caught. So it just goes back to this notion of the opportunities and the risks, and the secrecy really feeds into both of those sides in a negative way, I think.
So several of the questions are about campaign finance reform and how it can be, what changes are necessary to lessen the influence of money in our politics. One of the things that struck me up in Albany was the number of fundraisers that take place during the legislative session, and that many incumbents who face little, if any, primary or general election competition raise money from the very lobbyists that they're meeting with during the day. And it, from my take, it's more or less legalized bribery. In that they go from meetings during the day to legislative receptions at night where these legislators, these lawmakers, take contributions. They don't really spend it on campaigns because they don't have any opposition, but they are allowed to use these contributions for any expense incurred while fulfilling the obligations of their office, personal use. One of the proposals is to strictly to restrict the use of campaign funds for personal use. What do we think about trying to end the practice of holding political fundraisers in the state capitol during the legislative session, and about restricting the use of campaign funds for personal use or office activity? Richard Briffault?
Well, the personal use, I think, is pretty straightforward. The only reason that campaign contributions aren't bribes is because they're not being used. They're not supposed to be for personal use. They're supposed to go into a campaign fund because it's appropriate for legislators or executives or anybody to run for office, and unless you're independently wealthy, you need to raise money. Or unless at some point we actually have public funds, which we don't have now. So it's appropriate to raise money. Otherwise, for campaigns, if you just raise money for yourself, that's bribery. Or at least that's the kind of gifts that we think might turn into bribes. So it's very important to have a real wall around what these can be used for, that they can only be used for campaign purposes. New York City has a pretty good set of rules on this in terms of defining what's a campaign use and what's not. Federal government actually has pretty good rules on this in terms of what's a campaign use and what's not. New York State does not. And I actually think, Jennifer and I were talking on the way down, public finance is very important, but that's going to be a hard one. But there are some lower hanging fruit in terms of the kinds of things that I think everybody would agree are the kinds of things that need to be restricted. And to me, the lowest hanging of the fruit is to have real rules that provide that campaign money can only be used for true campaign activity and not to cover the cost of your home or your new car or a new wardrobe.
That's already illegal.
But it's not very well policed.
It's very well policed, but he's right, but for different reasons.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I interrupted.
No, go ahead.
No, let her go.
No, you go.
Okay, I'll go.
Who's on first?
I want to hear the real deal.
There's a problem here. There's a real problem, and it should take the kind of remedy that the other Richard is suggesting. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of controversy about that, with one exception, and that's legal fees. Joe Bruno was eventually found not guilty. I shouldn't say that. He was found guilty, and then it was overturned on appeal. $2 million. I couldn't afford that. I'd plead guilty even if I wasn't. So the question of the use of this for legal fees is going to become an issue. The rest of it, tanning salons, trips to Florida, if that's happening now, it ought to be prosecuted. And if for some reason the law is inadequate to that, that law ought to be changed. I fully agree. But I do think that when that discussion comes up, I love prosecutors. I love them. They're wonderful. We need them. Sometimes they're wrong.
Richard, how do you feel about banning capital fundraisers during the legislative session?
So I can take the money if I'm home? Silly. The small contributions, $400 or $500 to average members, is a good thing. The problem isn't that the people are showing up at fundraisers and writing checks for $300. The problem is that the unions and the hedge fund guys are writing checks for $150,000. The more public fundraising there is, if you're going to have fundraising, the better.
Okay. How would you rate U.S. Attorney Barrera's efforts to root out corruption? Is he doing a good job?
Go ahead, I dare you.
That's one of the questions.
I mean, that's my old office. Pete's a friend of mine. So with those caveats, I think he's doing a great job. He's got terrific people. They're working hard. Can't do everything. He's recently taking some heat for having been very outspoken about public corruption in a broader sense, and also for speaking out about the Silver case publicly, more publicly than U.S. attorneys sometimes do. But my assessment is that his office is doing a terrific job and is picking up some of the slack from some of the local offices that you would hope would be doing more. And I say that not to blame them. I mean, for the reasons I mentioned earlier in terms of the tools they have and the resources they have or don't have, it's not an easy task. But that's my assessment. I think he's doing a terrific job, and the Eastern District as well.
One of the ways in which legislators have been tripped up is through the per diem reimbursements, claiming that they're in Albany for days that either they are there not doing business or not there and claiming that they are. What is your position on the issue of per diem payments? Attorney General Schneiderman tonight recommended a receipt-based reimbursement system. Others, like Citizens Union, are urging the continuation of the per diem system, so long as there's verification of their presence in Albany doing official business. What's your point of view on reimbursements?
To the extent they're being abused, it ought to stop, and it ought to stop fast. I have a feeling they're going to go to a reimbursement system, even though the other system is cheaper and easier in the systemic sense, because it's just going to solve the problem of doing it. But it isn't just the legislature. All kinds. Statewide officials use helicopters. They could drive. The thruway doesn't work anymore? There's more money spent on helicopters than there is in every per diem for the legislature combined. So, okay, yeah, sure. Make it real.
Attorney General Schneiderman talked about a 4-year term for legislators. Others have talked about term limits as a way in which to reduce the length of service in the legislature, as a way in which to create turnover and competition so that people don't get so tied to power. Is term limits a way to go in reducing corruption or bad behavior in Albany, or lengthening the term so that they're not having to run every 2 years? Jennifer, do you have a point of view on that?
I mean, not really with any particular expertise. I mean, I think a 4-year term sounds reasonable to me. Running every 2 years sounds crazy. Sounds like you're probably always fundraising, which is a problem. Term limits, I don't know. I mean, you do want your legislators to have some expertise and to have some seniority. So I don't know. I don't have really strong views on that other than as a citizen. So maybe this Richard, the other Richard.
I think what we need are actually more vigorous elections rather than term limits per se. You get people who get indicted or sometimes even convicted and then get reelected. I think what you need to have is a system in which people can challenge. We have a lot of one-party districts in the state, so you need to have vigorous primaries in the districts that are largely one party or the other. I think a more vigorous electoral system, which would involve campaign finance reform with public funding, and a better redistricting process, which we should appear to be moving towards in the next redistricting cycle, would be the real thing. I think I still believe in elections, but they have to be real contested elections, and too many of our elections are not. And so the only way, I'm not sure how to make them more contested. I think some reforms of redistricting, I think a real campaign finance system are 2 steps in the right direction, and we'll see what would happen.
I agree with him.
Yeah, you agree. So Governor Cuomo has used the budget process to push for legislative changes in ethics and education. First part of that is, should he, he's obviously exercising authority. Should he? Does it disempower the legislature's role in adopting the budget and in addressing some of these ethics proposals? And his one question here is, education proposals wreak at pay-to-play given the $2 million in campaign contributions from charter school operators. What can be done to stop the influence of special interests such as this?
The other Richard? No? Okay. It's a scandal. Scandal. Not because of pay-to-play. If you're going to hold Andrew Cuomo responsible for his budget based upon what came in the campaign, every issue will be suspect. I think he's an honest man. I think he's a misguided honest man, but nonetheless an honest man. I think he's playing in a system which allows for legal, unethical behavior. And, this, as Hyman Roth says to Michael Corleone, this is the business we chose. It's awful that the branch of, we are a beacon of democracy around the world, not because we have effective chief executives. Saudi Arabia has an effective chief executive. We are a beacon of democracy and liberty around the world because we have legislative bodies that check them. And I thank the other Richard for his compliments, but if I did anything worth doing is I showed that you can use the subpoena and you can stop a governor. The notion that in a democracy, the governor can say to you, we're going to increase the use of standardized testing to evaluate teachers, and you can't vote no on it, is a scandal. That's what I really think.
Very strongly put. We're going to move to closing comments in just a minute, but I wanted to ask one more question here. What role does the media or press, what role can the media or press play in bringing about reform? Have they served enough as a watchdog function in holding government accountable? What more could they be doing? Are they effective?
That's hard to say, but I don't think they're that effective. Certainly no one had even brought the media didn't have any silver allegations. Let's just think for the moment they're just allegations. I think the traditional media, I think they've been cutting back the size of their Albany staffs. There needs to be more attention. I just think that in general, and this in some ways, I'm going to give the answer to one of your wrap-up questions right now, which is, what's one of our problems here? One of our problems is actually that Albany's in Albany, which is to say, there are academic studies that show that corruption spikes where the capital city is a small place away from the metropolis. This is internationally, not just in the United States. There are problems in Harrisburg, and there are problems in Springfield, in Illinois, and in Baton Rouge.
But Chicago is fine?
Chicago, but Springfield is where the corruption is. So you're right. The real repository is Boston, because Massachusetts has problems. Everyone has problems, but there's a sense of they're not watching as much. Albany is far away. We have a ton of media in the city halls across the street, and people are watching there all the time. They may not catch everything, but they're watching. Washington, people are watching. People aren't really watching Albany. No one wants to go there. It's not a bad place, actually, but the train ride's terrific.
Nobody wants to go
I lived there for 2 years.
Well,
it was hard to get visitors. People don't want to watch. I mean, it's harder to watch when it's there. I mean, it's appropriate. It's in the middle of the state. Upstate New York, Western New York, they have rights too, of course. But it just thinks by not being in a metropolis, it doesn't get the same attention. People in New York City don't have any sense of what Albany does. People in New York City know about the city government, they know about the national government. We in New York City and in Long Island and Westchester, I don't think there's a really strong sense of how important the state government is. And it's not just about corruption. It's about everything that they do. And it's just undercovered. Whether it's the corruption stuff or all the political issues are just not adequately covered, except maybe when they directly impact New York City. And I think the media just doesn't do it. Now, maybe we're entering an era of new media. Maybe there'll be more citizen media, more independent bloggers. Maybe more stuff will start to happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And also, investigative reporting is on the decline as well. And it used to be that at the U.S. Attorney's Office, one of the ways you thought about how to open new cases was, you read the newspapers. Honestly, you see what the reporters are writing about, and some of the biggest cases over the years, not just in the corruption realm, but in other areas too, are ideas you get from the newspaper, because investigative reporting is a really powerful tool. And as newspapers decline, that's been one of the areas I think that they've been cutting back on, and I think it's a shame.
There is something of a regional disparity and a class disparity. If you're on upstate where there are local papers still and local TV and radio, people know who their member of the Assembly and senators are. That's New York City, they don't. It's also a class phenomenon. Aside from school aid and education and second public education issues, the interest in state government that I experienced was generally from the upper middle class, somewhere in the middle down. And the higher on the socioeconomic scale communities were, the less they knew or cared. And that, I think, to some extent, is a function of New York City's. I mean, if you're in an urban, non-Caucasian district, you know who your assemblyman is pretty much. If you're in Scarsdale, you just don't need any help, And I think there's something with that.
Some choice comments here tonight that if they get out on the Twitter sphere, it will be interesting.
Well, I'm a lost cause anyway. But as to the press's paying attention, they don't write about anything but scandal from the point of view of the members. So you pick up the Post in the morning, you pick up the Daily News. Occasionally 47 Republican senators do something nutty, so you get a day's break from the Daily News. But generally speaking, and if you read the editorials, the members have stopped reading the editorials. You can't kill somebody twice. Once you've been executed and condemned and stepped on and kicked, do it twice. What the hell? So I really think there's more to this question about the role of the press than it seems. And I other than bemoaning going to Albany, I think there's probably we should have had a reporter on this panel. Maybe it would have helped.
We tried. So, in closing comments, answer the central question for us here. What changes are needed to summarize for state lawmakers, or we'll say our state capital, our state government, to earn back the public's trust? What can be done to restore public's trust in our state government? What reforms need to happen in the next couple of weeks as this budget is getting decided and the governor has inserted the ethics proposals into the consideration of this budget? And we'll begin with Jennifer. And then we'll go to Richard Brodsky, and then we'll go to Richard Briffault.
Gee, I thought we were going to end on, what can the general public do? So it's going to, encourage people to vote and all of that. Look, I think a lot of the things that we've been talking about, I'm glad there's a conversation around a ban or a limit on outside income. I think we really do need to strengthen the disclosure requirements. I think a number of things that have been proposed are important. Maybe the most important thing, though, is to keep this conversation going and for people to keep paying attention because, as was mentioned earlier, one of the things that happens is this cycle of a scandal and everyone pays attention and you pass some reforms that go a little bit of the way but not nearly far enough, and then everybody doesn't pay attention anymore. And some of that is valid because once you change things, you do need to see whether they're going to be effective or not. You have to give reform some time to see if they're going to work or not. But you know, it's been a long, tortured cycle over and over. So, you know, I'm glad that there have been some kind of bolder proposals made. I hope that as soon as the budget is passed with whatever manages to get through it, that doesn't end the conversation, that people will continue to think about these things. You know, I do think New Yorkers deserve legislators who are working in their interests. And so, you know, I think that a lot of what's been discussed tonight, and, you know, Richard Briffault may return to some of the things he started with at the beginning, and all of those, I think, are really important ideas and really strong ideas to try to.
So taking that, what can the average New Yorker do?
Well, I mean, the fact that folks are here on a Monday night at 8 o'clock is really important. You know, I wouldn't need to tell a group like you all to vote and to pay attention, right? You're really speaking to the choir, preaching to the choir in that regard, that folks that need to pay attention are not the ones who are here. But, you know, I would encourage all of you, and I think some of you already are, but to become watchdogs, right? There's a lot more information out there than there used to be. You can now actually access a lot of data online. Just one example is the Open Book New York website that the Comptroller's Office runs. You can see what the state is spending, for example. And if you have the time and the inclination, you know, poke around some of these sites. You don't have to do a FOIL request anymore and litigate with state agencies to get information. It's coming online more and more all the time. So I think what the public can do really is to become another watchdog. And if you see something, you know, tell law enforcement, tell your local media, tell me at my center, tell one of the good government groups. So I think if the public kind of becomes another watchdog, that's probably the most valuable thing that you can do.
If the precise question is what can be done to regain the public's trust, I think the answer is nothing. It is a lost battle.
How inspiring.
I'm sorry?
How inspiring.
No, I'm not finished. I'll inspire. Give me a minute. I think the better question is what can be done that will improve the efficient and ethical performance of government. And there's a lot of stuff. And I'm not the possessor of all those ideas. I like my ideas. I like some of the others. I really dislike some of the stuff that's been suggested. But the follow on Jennifer's, I think, plea, do engage, but engage in a rigorous and realistic way, because the members of the legislature really want to try to figure out what to do, most of them. And citizen thinking about this that goes beyond you're all crooks, thieves, and sheep will actually have an impact. And there is no better audience in the world capable of doing that than this one. I assume all of you know who your Assemblymember and Senator are. Okay? Then run. Okay? If you're the only one who thinks they're worthless, there's a problem. If they really are worthless, you'll be able to persuade some people.
Maybe you need to have a conversation with members of the audience participating. Maybe we have something to contribute.
That's what the questions are for.
Okay. So on that happy note, wait a minute, I'm not done. I was going to conclude with this. I fear that my contribution to the evening was to muddy issues that actually do, in political sense, require some clarity and outreach. The way in which things will change, be it in the governor's office, the controller's office, or in the legislature, is a combination of anger and careful thought. To the extent I muddied the water, I guess I'm a little sorry. To the extent that I was trying to give you a sense of how the average member thinks and experiences this, I hope it was helpful. And it's been so long since I've been accused of being frivolous that I'm sort of, maybe it wasn't such a bad thing.
I think I would like one thing. My wish list would be that this event happen in the committee rooms in Albany. What's so striking is they don't have hearings like this that are publicly attended with lots of media in which they actually explore, in that slow, rational, with evidence way, campaign finance reform and ethics reform. I actually don't want this to be, to have the budget hijacked in a process where there's no public debate and no public participation and no people working through public interest groups who are just showing up. But I think what people should do is write to their legislators and work with interest groups, work with Citizens Union, work with Common Cause, work with any other groups in the room, is to actually get hearings in Albany in April and May in June. Not in the budget process, because this is not really a budget item, but to actually press them, to have the chairs of the relevant committees show that they're not puppets of the three men in the room, and actually hold a hearing with bills. Consider the Attorney General's bills. Consider Richard's proposals. Consider our proposals. Consider others' proposals. But actually think through, is outside limits and outside income appropriate, and how do you define it? As you point out, there's some issues. And what about spouses? Think through campaign finance reform stuff. Hold a hearing and vote in public in a committee before, and then on the floor. And not just give it to the three people, what are they going to work out? I think, maybe I don't know how we get that except a lot of people demanding it. But if that actually happened, I almost care less about what the result is than if they actually had that process. And then, because if they have that process once, they might have it again later, and it might get better over time. But I think we actually need to get them to take this issue seriously. And the only way we're going to see that is if they take it seriously.
Great. Well, thank you. All right. So, as a follow-up, if you haven't signed up to become involved in Citizens Union's effort over the next couple of weeks and months in Albany to bring about ethics reform, there's a sign-up sheet outside. And so please get involved, stay involved. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the panelists.